Hi, I'm Dennis with BestMyTest.com. Today we're going to continue talking about IELTS Academic Writing Task 1. Today we're going to talk about percentages. Now when you see a pie chart, usually you're going to see percentages. And a lot of students get confused about this. They don't know exactly the right way to talk about percentages. So what I want to do today is I want to tell you very clearly how do we talk about percentages, and I also want to give you some options so that you can diversify your vocabulary and score the best that you can. All right, let's get started. Okay, let's talk about it. Here we got an example chart here. And as you can see, this pie chart depicts the energy generation by fuel type in the UK in the year 2014. Nuclear power, gas, renewables, oil, and coal. Okay, so I'm going to show you some patterns that you can use to describe that. But before I do, I want to tell you something that applies to all of them. And it's about how do you write percent. Now, there's three different ways you can do it. You can say percent as one word, you can say percent as two words, or you can just write the symbol like that. All three are perfectly acceptable. And so I don't know if you know this, but percent means per 100, right? It's a Latin word. Cent is comes from a Latin word. So percent means per 100. All right, let's get into the sentence patterns. So the first one, energy produced by oil accounted for 4% of the total energy in 2014, right? Pretty straightforward. Oil, 4%. Straightforward. Accounted for 4%. Next one, energy produced by renewables made up 15% of the total energy in 2014, right? I'm talking about the percentage, and I'm just using a different vocabulary for that. I can change this. Energy produced by oil made up 4% of the total energy. That's okay too. Next one. Energy produced by nuclear power constituted 22.5% of the total energy in 2014. That's constituted 22.5%. Same thing. You can plug in any of these numbers into these patterns. Constituted, made up, accounted for. Now here's something that you might want to look out, this dot, right? Some people say 22.5. Whatever you do, don't say 22.5. 22.5, okay? 0.5, 0.7, 0.6, point whatever. All right, next. Energy produced by coal comprised 28.4% of the total energy in 2014. Again, same thing. You can use comprised up here. Energy produced by oil comprised 4% of the total energy in 2014. You can swap them around, no problem. Last one, gas accounted for 30.1% of the energy production in 2014. So yeah, as you notice, this is the same pattern up here, but we're just showing that you can change what comes after it, right? You don't have to just say the total energy in 2014. There's ways that you can vary what comes after it as well. And that diversification of your vocabulary is going to demonstrate your ability to use the English language. Okay, so let's move on. Now we're going to talk about how do you compare two percentages, or talk about two percentages in one sentence. Let's look at a couple sentence patterns. Okay, so first off, let's look at this word, comprised. Comprised is a really high level vocabulary word. If you can find an appropriate place to use it and you can use it correctly, do it. Comprised means to be made up of. So energy production in the UK comprised. Energy production in the UK is made up of, means the same thing. Energy production in the UK comprised 4% oil, 15% renewables, 22.5% nuclear power, 28.4% coal, and 30.1% gas in 2014. So I just did, in one sentence, I described the entire chart in a really concise way. Okay, now perhaps you just want to talk about two percentages in one sentence, or maybe three. So there's a special word that you can use to do that, and that's respectively. So in 2014, coal and gas accounted for 28.4% and 30.1% of energy production in the UK, respectively. So this respectively means that these two numbers account for the two nouns that preceded it. So it went coal and gas, and so that means coal is 28.4 and gas is 30.1. Okay, so respectively allows you to talk about two distinct percentages in one sentence. But what if you wanted to combine them? Well, this is how you would do that. You combine these two numbers, and that is, what is that, 58.5%. And then here you change respectively, you would change that to collectively, right? In 2014, coal and gas accounted for 58.5% of energy production in the UK collectively. And that collectively is just a way to let us know that those two percentages have been added together. So now you got a way to talk about them separately and together. And if you can use that, that's going to help your score. All right, let's move on. Now, so we talked about percent, right? 5%, 20%, 26.4%. That's important to be able to talk about that. But some students make the mistake of talking about percentage, and they use it in the wrong context. So here's a way to remember it. Every time you say percent, it must have a number that comes before it. 25%, 27.4%. Percent must always be preceded by a number. Now, percentage is how you can kind of talk about a portion of something that's separate from the number. Let me show you what I mean. So the percentage of energy produced, right? So the chart is all about energy produced. And the percentage of energy produced by oil, okay, the percentage of energy produced by oil, I'm talking about that section right there, was 4% in the UK in 2014. So that's just one way to kind of separate the number from percent, right? 4% becomes the percentage was 4%. Means the same thing, right? So there's two ways to talk about percent there. But percentage you can use in a different way. You can use it in more ways than that. So let's look at an example here. So here, this sentence is going to talk about the entire chart. It's a way to describe the entire chart in a concise way. The chart illustrates the percentage of electricity generated by fuel type in the UK in 2014. So now we know exactly what the chart's about without like going through and naming the exact amount for every percent as we did in this first example. So that's another way that you can use percentage. Sorry, that's another way you can use percentage. Okay, so now I want to show you how to use percentage to talk about a piece of a whole. And it's important for you to know that we're not talking about exact numbers. We're not talking about 4%. We're talking about small percentage or large percentage. Let me show you what I mean. On the board here, I got a sentence with two blanks. And the first one, you add the piece of the whole. So you can put renewables in here. You can put nuclear power. So let's take oil, for example. As we already talked about, you could say energy produced by oil accounted for 4% of the total energy in 2014. We already talked about that. You can do that. But if you wanted to add some diversity to how you're writing about this, then you can say energy produced by oil accounted for a small percentage of the total energy in 2014. Right? It's a way to vary how you're using these terms, how you're talking about this chart. Now, obviously, if it's coal, you're not going to say small percentage. You're going to say large percentage. So you have to think about what the small piece is in relation to the whole. Is it small or is it big? Now, also, on top of that, you can say percentage, right? A small percentage. But you could also say a small fraction. You can also say a large segment. They mean the same thing in this case. They mean the same thing in this case. So that's another way that you can use percentage. Now, if you wanted to do something else, you could even use this to compare two things. You can add than, and you can put the second piece there. Energy produced by oil accounted for a smaller percentage of the total energy in 2014 than coal, for example. So in that way you can really take it up and make this sentence a comparative sentence by changing this to ER and adding than and your second piece there. Okay, if you haven't picked up the message that I'm trying to put down, it's that if you vary your vocabulary, you're going to score higher, right? So now what I want to do is I want to show you a different way to talk about percentages. Okay? So here's the percentage and here's what you would say. Okay? So 10%, you can say 1 in 10. And then 1 in 10, and then you need to put a noun right here. 1 in 10 people, 1 in 10 schools, 1 in 10 countries. Now, if it's 20%, you can say 2 in 10. If it's 50%, you can say 5 in 10. If it's 70%, you can say 7 in 10. Okay? Just make sure you put a noun afterwards. And then moving on. So 20%, we also say a fifth. A fifth. Make sure you get that. A fifth. 25%, you can say a quarter or 1/4. So again, if it's 50%, you know, you could say 2 quarters. It'd be a little strange. So you'd really say half. If it's 75%, you're going to say 3/4. 33%, that's a third. 40%, 2/5. Also, you can say 4 in 10. 50% is half. 60% is 3/5 or 6 in 10. Both are okay. 80% is 4/5. 90% is 9 in 10. Okay, so that's how you can use words to talk about percentages in a different way. Now here, 1 in 10 and then noun, right? So for the rest of these, you got to add of. A third of, and then you put a noun. A third of noun. A third of energy production. A fifth of air pollution, for example. Make sure you put of and then a noun. So I want to give you one more really useful vocabulary, and that means to be halved. Now when something's halved, it's dropped by 50%. It's cut in half. So you can say, right, is halved, was halved, were halved, are halved. You just conjugate to be into the proper form, and then you add halved. Okay, now let's look at some examples. So we got our words here, our percentages, and our words here. First example, according to the pie chart, and we don't have a pie chart, right? Just an example sentence. How much, what percentage of imports came from India? Now we want a word that means 75%, right? And so 75% is 3/4. So we can say, according to the pie chart, 3/4 of, and we got that of already there, of imports came from India. Next one. Oil accounted for what percent of electricity production? So we want something that means 80%. So here, could we say 8 in 10? Could I say 8 in 10 of electricity production? And you can't. And that's another thing about this. 1 in 10, 7 in 10, 6 in 10, you can only use with countable nouns. You can only use with countable nouns. And electricity production is not countable. So we can't say 8 and 10. But we can say 4/5. So oil accounted for 4/5 of electricity production. Boom. All right. Production of TVs in the period between 2012 and 2014. Now we want it dropped by 50%. Okay? To be halved. But we got to conjugate the verb. So production of TVs. That's the subject of the sentence. So to be, we need to say that production is it, right? I, you, he, she, it, we, they. It's it. So we say was halved. Was halved in the period between 2012 and 2014. So for this one, when you're conjugating to be, you got to make sure you know what the subject is. And your subject's always I or you, he, she, it, we, or they. It's always one of those. All right, so now people prefer to take the bus. So now 10%. Okay? 10%. 1 in 10, okay? Is people a countable noun? It is. So this is a safe place to use 1 in 10. 1 in 10 people prefer to take the bus. And that's some example sentences of how you can use these words to vary your vocabulary. Okay, so we just talked about how to talk about these common fractions that we use in everyday speech. But what about if something's not quite those round numbers that we often use? Well, let me show you how to talk about those. So 12%, it's not 1 in 10, but it is slightly more than 1 in 10, right? So if you just add a modifier, slightly more than 1 in 10, that could be 12%, sure. It's not an exact number, and that's okay. You could also say slightly less than 1 in 10 if it's like 9%. Right? So you can change more to less, no problem. So for here, for 15%, that's not a fifth, but it is less than a fifth. 23%, it's not a quarter, but it's less than a quarter. So in the same way, like 28%, you can say slightly more than a quarter, or you can just say more than a quarter. You can say just under a third. You can say just under a half, or just over a half. So you can use these modifiers, just under, just below, just over, just above, slightly more, slightly less, to modify these very useful vocabulary. Okay, so now let's look at some example sentences and how we can use them. So, something of people said that driving to work was safer than cycling. Well, it's 11%. It's not 1 in 10, but it is slightly more than 1 in 10. So we can put that in there. Slightly more than 1 in 10 people said that driving to work was safer than cycling. Great. Now you can say 11% of people, that's fine, but this is showing how well you can use the English language. You're using diversified vocabulary. That's important. Okay, so we're looking for a number that means about 15%. Which one means about 15%? Well, we could say less than a fifth. So we can say less than a fifth of people stated that they cycled to work because they did not have to worry about parking. Great sentence. All right, moving on. Number 3. We're looking for something that means 32%, okay? So we could just say just under a third or just below a third. Both of those will work well. So we say the proportion of people stating that they cycled to work to reduce pollution stood at just under a third. Okay, that's great. Now, one thing to note about this sentence. Here we say proportion, and that's a great word. But you can also say percentage. The percentage of people. Great. All right, last one. Now we're looking for a word that means 23%. Well, 23% is less than a quarter. Or you can say just under a quarter. That's okay too. So mobile calls showed a gradual rise of less than a quarter from 2000 to 2001. So the main takeaway here is that, sure, you can just say the percentages exactly, and that would be correct. But if you want to diversify your vocabulary, and you do, then you can use these phrases to modify common percentages and to give you another way to talk about numbers. Okay, welcome to the end of the video. Congrats, you made it. So today we talked about percentages and really focus on how to talk about those pie charts well. Next video, we're going to talk about line graphs and how to manage your vocabulary and diversify your vocabulary so that you can talk about that in many different ways. So I'll see you in the next video.